2:00. I better begin straight away. It's just turned 2. Hello everyone. Hello. It's so lovely to see this big crowd here. I'm just taking a moment because I remember a while ago I was down in Seattle doing a book tour, and I showed up at the university bookstore, the Barnes & Noble, to do my reading before the adoring crowds, which completely failed to materialize to the extent that there was actually no one there. This was a few years ago, but it's Americans, no offense. So it's just lovely to have a big crowd here for an audience with. Whenever I hear the word "an audience with," I think of Dame Edna Everage. You know her. So I'm sorry to say I haven't got any gladioli to hand out, and nor will I revert to an Australian accent too often, but I might do. But it's absolutely delightful to be here. I've just come from a rather heavy session. I can recognize some of the faces who were in there talking about literary versus genre fiction, and I think I was a little controversial because it's all writing to me. It really is, and it's such a wonderful privilege for me to be a writer. It's extraordinary, and I'm in a room of writers, so you know what I mean. What I thought I'd do today, I sort of wrote out a few ideas, and now I'm frantically scribbling and changing, and new ideas are coming up. So it's going to be a little loosey-goosey, I suppose. I tend to do this. I tend to sort of set out with an agenda and then completely disregard it. It's a bit like my outlines, which I only ever write when I finish my first draft anyway. That's when I tend to outline, and then I'll write an outline and think, okay, yes, and I look at it once, and then it's gone. I never look at it again. I thought I'd begin a bit. I mean, I'm sure some of you are aware of some of my bio, perhaps, but many are not. You can probably guess from my accent that I am not from your land. Except that I am, because I was born in Toronto, surprise, surprise. And I left when I was 2, but then, again, surprise, surprise, I didn't go to England, I went to LA, and I was an LA kid till I was 7 years old, and then went to England. And I suppose my whole life really has been working my way to fully accepting the label of storyteller. That's what I am, though I've always been one. From the earliest time I can remember, my earliest memories and recall is being a storyteller. There's a picture of me. One of the earliest pictures of me is in the full Zorro outfit. So we were living in California, so I was in the mask and the hat, and of course the sword, which came to play a huge role in my life and possibly still does. It seems strange to say, but as far as someone can make a living from the sword in the 21st century, I've contrived to do it, either wielding it on stages or on screen or writing about the wielding of it in my books. Not exclusively so, you'll be pleased to know. But so that storyteller's journey is interesting, and of course it began. Well, I suppose preconception, really, because I come from a family of storytellers. My dad was an actor. All my grandparents were actors. My dad was also a writer, and as were my 2 grandfathers in different ways. I'm half Norwegian. My Norwegian grandfather was quite the well-known novelist and non-fiction writer in Norway. And then there's the sort of family legacy you're born into. I sort of would defy anyone not to become a writer when their parents are a Battle of Britain pilot and a Norwegian spy. Which story I'm hoping to write in the next year or so, actually. I'm finally getting around to it. People have been saying, you've got to write that story. And I'm going, well, I'm going to try. And I have actually made some strides towards that now. There's a slight addition to that. My mother was actually a former Miss Oslo as well. So she was a beautiful Norwegian spy. So it's... So I think there was I don't know if you can call it a curse, a blessing, whatever it was laid on me quite early on. I told stories all the time as a child. I was always making up stuff. It is, I don't want to be one of those people who goes, oh, the younger generation today and all that. But I do look at my 13-year-old son sometimes on his screen and I think, well, yes, you're doing stuff. And he's extraordinarily creative and he has his own YouTube channel. He's 13 years old. So he is doing creative stuff. But a lot of the time he's just spent flicking through Snapchat, right? And I'm thinking there was no Snapchat when I had to make my own Snapchat when I was a kid. So with my friends. And so we'd be out there, doing the sort of cliched cowboys and Indians, or more likely for me it was knights or Robin Hood or Zorro or anything where I could wield a piece of stick as a sword. So that began that process pretty early. I'm actually going to talk about the word process quite a bit because it's the storyteller's journey to going from just someone who wanted to tell stories and enjoyed telling stories to someone who actually could make a sort of living telling stories was an interesting one. I wasn't a particularly troubled child, though things happened. Things went on. I was a sleepwalker for a start. This was, obviously, and a sleep talker and all sorts of strange sleep things happened to me. The walking was slightly concerning, especially when we moved into a house that was essentially a building rubble zone, and my parents decided I better come sleep in their bed till it was fixed because there was a long shaft in the middle of the house, which I might well have jumped down when I left my bedroom and went seeking whatever I was seeking. I gradually grew out of it, kind of like my nosebleeds, which also were beset me in my youth. I was always told I'd grow out of them, and gradually did. The sleepwalking, I finally decided it needed to end when I was living in London in my late 20s, and I woke up outside my apartment on the landing holding a vacuum cleaner naked. And fortunately the door was still open, so I managed to get back inside. But I thought, no, this really, I should stop this. So, so I had some interesting things going on. So I think my storytelling went into my sleep as well. I didn't really know what I wanted to do for the longest time. I think I was reasonably intelligent, but I was lazy. I wasn't interested in anything I wasn't interested in. I'm sure that people are nodding. I just couldn't be bothered. I scraped every single exam I took, scraped it up to the age of 16. Even history, which I loved, I sort of kind of scraped through the exam because I couldn't be asked, as they say in England. I knew I needed to scrape it in order to move on, but that was kind of it. But my other stuff going on with what I was starting to write and starting to act and started to think about was where I put my energies. And then when I was 16 years old and living in London at this time, I met one of those teachers who just turned it all around. He wasn't one of those, he was a history teacher and was obviously my passion. And, but he wasn't one of those guys who would just say, this is the order of things, and Queen Anne took the throne in 17, and all that. He would just sort of lean against his desk. He was a northerner in England, and he'd lean against his desk, and he'd say, that Napoleon, he was a rum bugger. and having no clue what a rum bugger was, but being very interested, I thought it had something to do with booze, and at 16, of course, that was beginning to intrigue. But then he'd make you go away and read it. You'd have to go away. And suddenly, from nowhere, I became an academic. I was suddenly really, and within 2 years, they wanted me to go to Cambridge and read history, and I was going to do all that. And then, having resisted the family curse, the acting curse, I contrived to get myself cast as the lead in a school play. It was a two-hander called Edward Albee's The Zeus Story. If anyone knows, it's an extraordinary one-act play, and a sort of a real tour de force of a role. And I played it, and of course all those genes kicked in, and suddenly I thought, and then I won the Best Actor award at a school's drama festival, and suddenly I had girls going, "Oh, you're a marvelous actor." I'm going, "Oh, girls." Ooh. So I went to an all-boys school, right? So suddenly it all seemed much more intriguing, and I decided not to go to university, and I went to drama school instead, and hence that career began in that form of storytelling. I think one of the main drives for me becoming an actor was so I could leap around with bladed weaponry, and be well paid for it. And so I did that a lot, actually. I've acted in a lot of stage plays which required sword play. The biggest acting role I ever did, well, in terms of prestige, I suppose, I played in a biblical Roman epic in the mid-'80s called A.D., or Anno Domini. Oh, some people are nodding. It was a big mini-series, and it was extraordinary because they had all these big Hollywood stars in it, like Ava Gardner and James Mason and Susan Sarandon, and people like that. I was basically unknown British actor I was doing Barefoot in the Park, the Neil Simon play in Exeter Rep, when I got a call to go up and audition for a small role in this biblical Roman epic that was going to shoot in Tunisia for 10 months for the NBC network. And I went in and the director, this American director, after I was probably just quite excited about being an actor. I was acting on stage, I loved that. And he looked at me and said, I'm going to screen test you for Caleb. I was scrambling back in my brain thinking, Caleb, that was the Jewish gladiator. I'm thinking, at the time I had long blonde hair. I'm pure Northern European, right? And I was thinking, okay, the guy's crazy, but it sounds like a good part. Anyway, I screen tested for it and got the part. Changed my life, took me to Hollywood, all that ensued. But ultimately, it allowed me to live all those fantasies of being a swashbuckler. I killed 9 men on screen. I fought as a retiarius, the net and trident gladiator, in a genuine Colosseum in North Africa. It was kind of creepy, actually, in the end, but because I was doing what they did, but they often died, and I obviously didn't. I went to my air-conditioned Winnebago and thought, I just need a cup of tea now. But it was a great opportunity, and I became an expert in things I love to be an expert in. Like I know how to use a biblical slingshot, for example, and fight with a net and trident. All useful skills on the streets of Salt Spring Island, where I live. But I think the important thing for me always was that I started to get more frustrated about being an actor. Had many wonderful opportunities and did some very interesting roles and worked with some fantastic people. But what I really wanted to do was tell my own stories, and I'd written in sort of I'd started a series of quite intense journals when I was about 26 and sort of wrote daily, but they were quite sort of, I suppose you'd call them creative non-fiction now. They were quite sort of not literary, but they had that sort of self-examination, but in prose that I was trying to make sort of work differently, and so it wasn't just the got up, had a drink, that sort of thing. And why I'm going to talk a bit more about process, the writing process, is that I, like everyone else, I think, probably starting out, didn't understand that writing is a process. I thought it was just a sort of thing that you either were able to do or not. And so when I start writing stories or little playlets or a play or a screenplay or something, I'd rapidly run out of steam and think, that's because I'm not a writer. And so what I teach now, and I can recognize a few faces from my masterclass, is about process, about separating out the stages of the process. And I didn't understand that, and that stopped me being a writer for so long, because I didn't understand that the first draft is not about good. It's not about anything other than getting the draft out. So that held me back for quite a while. And I make apologies, because I know I've talked to some people before, or I've spoken before, so repetitive stories, some will come out and some of you will have heard them before, but I'll tell them again anyway, because for the majority who haven't, perhaps. So I was in Calgary in 1992 doing the play Much Ado About Nothing at Theatre Calgary. Anyone see it? No, you see. So I was in Calgary doing that, and I'd got to that wonderful point in the actor's process where you've opened the play, you don't have to show up for rehearsals in the morning, you can do the play at night, which is fantastic fun. It was a good production, actually. I had a great part. And then you go out and drink a lot of beer, and then you sleep till noon, and you get up and read all day, rinse, recycle, repeat. It's a lovely life, and I miss it so much. It was so simple then. But in the reading part, I remember just, I finished one book, and I drifted out to a second-hand bookstore, and I thought, what do I fancy reading now? And I found this book called Tigana by this man I never heard of, Guy Gabriel Kay, and I quite liked the cover, and so I bought it and read it, and it was a sort of, it was one of those just the scales were removed from my eyes. I thought, God, this is exactly the sort of stuff I want to write. Not fantasy necessarily, because my love of history was still so strong, even though he bases his stuff very much on history. But the passion and the power and the complexity of the characters and the adventure and the swords, of course, and the way he worked emotion. I finished it on a plane flight to England and cried 6 times in the last 60 pages, which caused the air stewardess no end of grief. She kept coming up to me, "Are you all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Another whiskey, please." So that it sort of turned around. I thought, I want to do this so much. I love this so much. I must find a way to do it. Now, in that same year, I'd written a play, and it was because a play, I always thought, it was like if a novel is a mountain to climb, and I use that metaphor quite a lot when I teach, then a play was a hill. I thought I could see the end of it. Plus, it's theatre, plus it's dialogue, a world I was very versed in. So I'd written a play, and the reason I'd written it was because it was a 24-hour playwriting competition, which, unlike the ones today where you actually sort of do that at home and maybe have someone vet you, I don't know how it works quite. This was you actually went into a room at 5:30 at night and left at 5:30 the next night. You stayed there overnight, all that, and you wrote a play. It was part of a new play festival in Vancouver. And I thought, that is the way for me to finish something. It's not going to be about good. It's not going to be about anything. I was starting to understand that. It was just going to be about getting it down, finishing something. I need to finish something. Otherwise, how can I be a writer? So I went in with this, like a lot of early works, highly autobiographical. It was what had sort of sent me to Canada, and I won't go into details, but it was a tragic love affair that had ended very badly, but fortunately for the writer in me, very dramatically. And and being the vampire that we all are, of course, I used my past shamelessly and wrote this play. I didn't really expect anything to come of it except to finish it, but I went to the prize giving 2 days later, and I won the competition, which meant that I got a production the following year. So I left, having had the Tigana experience here, and went back to Vancouver to this production, which was awful. Absolutely awful. Terrible experience. Nearly put me off being a writer, but that's a whole separate story which you needn't go into. But it began me on that route. And then Calgary again had an effect on me, because I thought, well, I've written one play, maybe I can write another. And Lunchbox Theatre in Calgary was doing these things called the Petrocans, and they'd give you a little bit of money. And that's the point. For the play I was put on in Vancouver, I got $500. I thought, wow, I'm a professional writer. This is amazing. The Lunchbox in Calgary were offering these things, and I came up with an idea that was actually based on, it was a ghost story, but based on a Calgary idea that had happened to a friend of mine in his house in Calgary. And so I wrote that, and they commissioned it, and they put it on, so suddenly I was on the road. But, of course, what I really wanted to do was write historical fiction. And this is the origin story of my first novel, because they're all journeys, our books, aren't they? I mean, I always liken them to the journeys, and you set out, and that first step can come in all sorts of strange, wonderful, diverse ways. Sometimes they're very pragmatic. I can tell you a story or two later that it's just a very pragmatic way of beginning a story. Like, I want to make some more money. Let's write about something different than I was planning on writing about. But this one was, I didn't have any idea of making money. I just wanted to write a historical fiction book. And so I was in the gym in Vancouver, in Kitsilano, where I was living at the time, and I was working out. I'm an actor, I've got to keep reasonably fit, and so this is how it went. So I'm there doing a shoulder lift. This shows you a little bit about how my mind works and why people get slightly scared sometimes. Anyway, so here I am, and I'm doing a shoulder lift, and I'm looking in the mirror to check my form, of course, and I'm going like this, and I go, oh God, I got a long neck. Because I do have an exceptionally long neck, you see. So here's my brain works again. So if I was ever executed, that would be an easy shot for the axe. Or the sword, because Anne Boleyn was executed with a sword. Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on one hand. Bam. Lightning bolt. Bam. Just, what? I thought, wow, all those synapses connecting, that was that noise, by the way. They just did it again, wow. And so I went back to my apartment and I started writing some stuff down about that, just sort of riffing on it in a way that I learned to do much later on, just sort of riffing and writing fast and not thinking about anything much. And I came up with this sort of short story idea that was a sort of horror story, which I quite liked, but it wasn't really what I wanted to write. I didn't want to write a short story, apart from anything else. But I thought, well, I did a fair bit of work on it for a couple of weeks and then lost my faith in it, put it away. Life took over. I was acting quite a lot in those days as well. But it stayed in my head. And for the next 6 years, I began every so often. I mean, I think I always liken any idea I have for a book to like that folder icon on your desktop. That once you think about it, there it is. It's got a label, and it's taking stuff, even if you don't know it is. There's documents sort of bumping into it, and sometimes you open it and think, oh, there's all that. I didn't know that was there. And this was the case with the novel that became my first novel, The French Executioner. Because of the fear of the mountain, I just kept thinking, well, if ever I write that novel, which I probably won't because it's a novel, I will put into it everything I love, because obviously no one's going to read it but my wife and my mother anyway, so I might as well just, bung everything in. So I know it's all set in 1530s Europe, and the man who killed Anne Boleyn with a sword, Jean Rambeau is his name, and obviously there's going to be a battle at sea between slave galleys, because I always want to write that. Oh, there's a book on that, so I got the book down, read that. Document drops in the folder. I must do it's clear that I must do a black mass in the Archbishop of Siena's dungeon inside a kaleidoscope. Why not? So I read about kaleidoscopes and I read about black masses, and goes into the folder. I read about, I thought, yes, there's got to be mass hallucinations at some point. I read about the, ergot. I don't know how many of you know that, but that's where LSD is derived from. And they used to bake bread sometimes with ergot-infected rye, and then a whole village would trip out very, very badly. And it happened once, actually, the last time it happened, because it mainly died out once they got better with rye in the early 18th century, and it hardly happened anymore, except it happened once in France in 1952, and I got this book, St. Anthony's Fire, and I thought, well, I'll read that, because that's going to happen. Anyway, all those things went in. And then finally, I was in a cottage with my wife up in Shropshire in England. I'd moved back to England, but we'd moved back to England by then. And I found this book on mercenaries, and I thought, well, if ever I write that novel, which I probably won't do, but if ever I do, they'll all be mercenaries, of course. And I was reading about 16th century mercenaries. And I got about 20 pages in, and I turned to my wife and said, you know what, I think I'm going to write that novel now. And she said, it's about bloody time. She's heard me banging on about it for so long, But because of that crowded folder, I wrote it really fast, even though I was, still working as an actor and stuff. And I had it written in about 7 months or 8 months or something, quite a long novel as well. And then I thought, well, I'll go after an agent. I understood about agents being an actor, and I didn't exactly stalk her. There was an element of stalking, but nothing they could prove in court. So anyway, I got an agent, and she took me on, and then had the book sold really straight away. And everyone says, "Oh, you were so lucky. It happened. It happened so fast for you." I said, 25 years of thinking about writing novels. And the novel did pretty well, French Executioner. It's odd because I was talking to Brock about this earlier on, because he's a fan of the French Ex, and a lot of people are, because it's so. Like a lot of first novels, and I like reading people's first novels, because you are cramming everything in the fear that you'll never write anything again or whatever. So you're bunging all this stuff. It's like a shop with all the best goods on the street on a tray, right? It's here, come and look at this, isn't it fantastic? it is really historical fantasy, that book, strangely, because there's a lot of magical stuff that happens in it. Aside from the hallucinations in the Archbishop's dungeon in Siena, inside the kaleidoscope. So there's ghostly stuff, and but that launched me on my road. I then began when I finished the 2 books of the French Executioner, duology, as I believe it's called now, the duology, French X and Blood Ties. My editor at Orion in London then took me out to lunch and said, what are you going to write next? And I'd had this thought. And as an actor in 1987, I toured an 18th century comedy by Sheridan called The Rivals. And I played this character called Jack Absolute. And I loved being Jack Absolute. Jack Absolute was, maybe one of half a dozen roles in my life that I felt I nailed. It was close to kind of where I was, or what I could imagine anyway, or what I wanted to be, sort of dashing, rather unscrupulous, player at love, then gets hoisted on his own petard, and it all ends comically and well. But I loved the character. He was a real sort of shapeshifter. At least that's how I played him. And so but I realized if I was going to write about him, he had to be something other than this unscrupulous army officer, and this rogue. So when I sat down for lunch with my editor, and he said, "So what do you want to write next?" And I said, "I'm going to write about Jack Absolute." And he said, "Oh, who's he?" And I said, "He's the 007 of the 1770s." Which line was meant to be for his ears only, and then went, all across Amazon and everything like that. So anyway, that began that world for me, the Jack Absolute world. And then I'm gonna keep telling a couple of origin stories, because they're always different, and it's again about, in a way, illustrative of process. So I'd embarked on the Jack Absolute. I think I'd written the first one, actually, and I was writing the second one. And my agent, the one I didn't stalk, retired, and I needed to get a new agent. And I was really fortunate that French X actually was runner-up for the CWA, not CWA, the British, whatever the equivalent is. No, it is CWA, I think, Crime Writers Association Steel Dagger Award, the very first one. And I was runner-up. And the woman who organized it was just coming back into the business, having been away with some illness. And her name was Kate Jones. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. And she loved French X. And when she heard I was looking for an agent, she said, can he come here? And it was great. So, to be that, someone loving your work that much, especially your agent, of course, is wonderful. And so she took me out to lunch. And you'll notice a bit of a theme building here, and I'm afraid alcohol is at the root of a lot of my stories. She took me out to lunch, and it's true, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Agents always have an agenda, right? And so she says to me, "Have you thought of writing young adult fiction?" And I went, "Nope." And she said, "Because your stuff, the kind of stuff you write, adventurous, but character-driven, fun, good on families, all that stuff, I think it would work really well. Have you got any ideas?" And I went, "Nope." But I do what I do. I thought I'll just open my mind, or in this case, a notebook. And I was headed home on the tube that night, slightly the worse for some claret, I suppose. Claret's often at the root of my downfalls, I think. And I got home that night, and I was thinking about my slightly spooky Norwegian family, that Norwegian grandfather. My mother said that when I was born, she felt she knew me straight away, because in my first cry, she heard her father's laugh, which I think is a really spooky thing to say to a child. Thanks, Mum. But my grandfather was a bit spooky. He actually had the ability to leave his own body and go walking. He couldn't control it, but he did it. Right? It's called Vardagar. Anyway, I'd heard the stories. That wasn't what I was thinking about particularly. I was starting to just think, and I got home, and particularly when I go into schools, and I teach sometimes in schools, and I always say to the kids, it's all out there. It's all open. You can just begin stuff. And I opened this new notebook I had. I like there's this particular notebook. You know, us writers are a bit faddist, aren't we? We need to have the special pen and the special book, and I have this special book. Anyway, I opened the new notebook. There's one down there. I opened the new notebook and just started writing. And this is what I wrote. And this is not knowing almost anything. He's always near, yet never in sight. He came first in a dream, and finding a way in, returned again and again. Now he doesn't need to wait for sleep to come. He's coming closer to me every day. Soon I'll be him, and he'll be me. And then what will we do? What terrible things will we do? I was like, whoa, drop the pen, whoa. Step away from the desk. What's going on? And that became the beginnings of the trilogy I wrote for Knopf in New York, called the Runestone Saga. It was. I'm still hugely fond of those novels. It's and the boy in it, Sky. You can't get him if anyone's writing down the titles. By the way, we're trying to reissue them. But it was again that journey. I was and because it took a slightly strange detour, because my English publishers only wanted me to be an adult author, and they were really snippy about me moving into YA. And so my agent got really snippy with them for being snippy, and went to ICM New York, who were her partners, and they had read the treatment that I wrote. I have to say, this is in the days when, or maybe it was just the idea, I don't know, but it was quite a skimpy treatment, and one chapter, 10 pages, one chapter. And they and Knopf in New York went, have it like that within 10 days. So it was great. It was great. But I'll tell you one other story about that, because once I signed the contract to write this trilogy for Knopf in New York, you know, I met someone who said, well, they're the best publishers in the world. I went, oh my God, I'm going to be writing for teenagers. It's been decades since I was a teenager. And I was sitting with my brother-in-law. And Steve is a terrific guy, reads a ton, but not from the literary world at all. He was a logger, and he's a lathe operator, and so, you know, but he's a big reader, loves reading. And, you know, a guy from Vancouver Island, you know. And anyway, so we're sitting there having a beer, and I was freaking out a bit. It's going, oh, Steve, what am I going to do? I mean, what should I do? I'm going to be writing for teenagers. And he put his beer down, and he looked at me and went, freak the little fuckers out. Make them cry themselves to sleep. And I went, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So that's what I tried to do. Great writing advice. Yeah. It was interesting, because I then went back and forth with Jack. I alternated Jack and Runestone for a couple of years. But again, and claret is at the bottom of this too, this change in direction. I was at, and we're going to be talking about this one in a second. I was still in London, 2006 this was, and I arranged to meet up with my editor, John Wood, still the same guy, not with him now, but great guy, great friend, and editor of most of my books. Anyway, John was there with his agenda, of course, for lunch, buying me lunch and an agenda, and he wanted me to change the order of the Jack Absolute books. I had this plan to write the sequel to the original Jack Absolute, so I'd gone off and written a prequel and then the sequel to the prequel, and I wanted to get back to the first story and write the sequel to that, which people still nag me about, by the way. He wanted me to write the big book. Chris, we need the big book from you. And I thought, God, no, really? It's like no pressure or anything. So we were sitting there having lunch, and I think the claret and the idea was having its usual maudlin effect upon me, and I was going, And I said to him, so John, why aren't I a bestseller yet? Being greedy. He said, I said, why is so-and-so a bestseller, not me? He said, you're a way better writer than him. I said, so, why? And he said, well, and we worked out it was because I was making people up, and this other guy was writing about people who were already known. Historical fiction, like in a lot of areas, you need a marquee name, right? So if you got Julius Caesar or Genghis, so I was making people up. Jean Rambeau, well, kind of historical, but who hadn't been done? We started analyzing, and we couldn't come up with anyone. Alexander the Great, done to death. Well, literally done to death, of course. In fact, they're all done to death. What am I talking about? Anne Boleyn, already done it. You know, all these names. And John staggered off to the toilet, and I mean staggered, bumped into another table. I'm terribly sorry. And came back. He said, "I got the name for you." He looked down at me. Didn't even sit down. He said, "I got the name for you. I've figured it out, who you have to write about." And I said, "Who?" He said, "Dracula." And I looked at him and went, "Fuck off." Dracula? Don't be ridiculous. You mean the Impaler guy? He said, yeah. And I said, "Nah, it's gonna have been done. Must have been done." Hadn't been done. And I was so intrigued by the fact that such a story hadn't been done, I started researching it. You know, that's the historian in me, you know, the big go-to. And I immediately found out why it hadn't been done. Various reasons. One, it's an incredibly dark tale. And also, all the history had virtually was propaganda. I began to detect that quite quickly. And then, the thing that really hit me, and you know, we all decide to write this story, not that story, for a reason. The thing that hit me was that this man who I established quite rapidly had made his reputation impaling Turks, was raised by the Turks. From the age of 9 to the age of 15, he was a hostage. But with all growing up in the most luxurious conditions and going to the best school in the world, and until his father betrayed the Turks because he was a hostage, and he was thrown in the worst prison in Turkey for 2 years at the age of 15, and then released to go and begin his life and to help the Turks and be their vassal and stuff, which he had different ideas about. So it you know, all those ideas started working for me, and I then I launched onto that road, this road here. Easily the hardest book I've ever written, wrestling all that material. But because, you know, we all know that the things that are hardest are the things that teach us the greatest lessons, right? I mean, I was, you know, I think a reasonably competent novelist by then. I'd written some interesting books and stuff, but that book just kicked my ass, as they say. It really, to wrestle that sort of material into the sort of story I like to tell, which are, you know, full-on blood and guts adventure tales, character-driven. I came up with a framing device where I could get necessary, complicated history out of the way through people really needing to know it, because that old thing of info dumping doesn't work for me. You need someone to really need to know why this person is usurping the throne or that alliance is broken. And that structurally, I learned so much about structure. I learned a lot about character. I also learned a lot about I think tone and voice were things that I hadn't really considered much before, and I really had to with that book, because the elephant in the room, it's a real mixed metaphor, this was going to be the vampire, right? Vampire elephants. Be very messy. Oh, I've squashed another one. So that was interesting, and I mean it is my most so far my biggest seller for sure. It's sold in 13 different countries, and it keeps sort of popping up again. Like I'm suddenly big in Serbia because they just bought it, which is a late contender for my tombstone, I have to say, don't you think? He was big in Serbia. Though they'll put my name down as KK Humphreys. That is my Serbian name, KK Humphreys. And, you know, that was 2008 that came out, so I've written more novels since than I had before, and but the lessons I learned writing that were tremendous, and set a sort of style for... Though my problem is, as those who have read a bit of me know, that I'm a kind of a butterfly mind. I settle on something that really interests me, and then I write it. So I haven't been... And I think... It's unfortunate these days, I think, anyway, that people seem to want the same thing, just slightly different again. I mean, look at Lee Child, one of the most successful authors in the world. He writes the same book again and again, puts it in a different town. Same thing happens each time. Stranger walks into town, people try to beat him up, he beats them up, he saves the girl. You know, I mean, very skillfully done, but doesn't interest me. I'd probably be wealthier if I'd done that, and if I'd maybe stuck to Jack Absolute. If Vlad hadn't tackled Jack Absolute into the dirt, I would have been, people would have built up that sort of consistency of readership. But I'm interested in all sorts of different things. The time's just racing by, isn't it? I wanted to talk a bit about the origin stories of. There's a Jack there. That's Jack. Of fire and plague. Has anyone read those? Yeah, a few people. People read those. So plague was another one of those interesting origin stories because again it was a conversation with an agent. Claret wasn't involved this time because it was morning in Salt Spring and I was lying on my bed, and even I don't drink claret in the morning. I was having a conversation with my new agent, or actually wasn't that new by then, and he was in London. 10, right? Okay, and we were talking about moving publishers. You know, I'd been with Orion / Hachette for quite a while, and it just felt like a bit of an old relationship, and I wanted something new. And Penguin Random House said they really would like me to come to them, particularly in Toronto, Doubleday, because I knew them because they were kind of looking after my YA stuff, and I got to know the people there quite well, and they really liked my writing. But you have to come with something. So Simon was talking about, my agent was, we were still trying to come up with the big idea, and he was very good on ideas, Simon, but he was saying, books, people who love books, I mean, they love them, don't they? They love the touch of them and the smell of them, and they're opening those pages. They love books, He said, and the covers. He said, I can see walking into W.H. Smith and Son in Charing Cross Station and seeing this whole rack of books that are red and black and say plague. And I went, oh, hang on a second. You talking about the Great Plague of London? And he went, well, yes, as an example of books that are red and black. And I went, yeah, just give me a second here. And I went into my hut, and it became that thing that happens to us rarely, that channeling thing, where characters just literally marched into my hut. I didn't know that much about the Great Plague of London, 1665, little schoolboy history memories going, but I just started, again, writing. And it was like the door banged open as I sat down, and this man walked in and looked down at me and said, my name's Captain Coke. But I'm a highwayman, so I'm known as Captain Cock. You should put me in your book. And I went, okay. And then I have the thief, so obviously the next man to walk in was this huge Cockney fella, bald head, big beard. He said, my name's Pitman. I'm a thief taker. You put me in your book. And I went, you're definitely in. And then the door opened a third time, and a woman walked in. She said, my name's Sarah Chalker, and I'm an actress at the Theatre Royal, and my husband's gone missing. And I went, well, you're in too, love. Have a seat. And anyway, I came up with a treatment within a couple of hours, sent it off to my agent. He said, this is it. And flesh it out. So I fleshed it out a bit, 20 pages. Did I write? I don't think I even wrote a chapter. I didn't. But I wrote a very good kick-ass treatment. And they bought it, and so and fun enough, and this is one of those odd stories. The London publisher, Selina Walker, Selina 50 Shades of Grey Walker, the woman who brought that book into the house and changed publishing history, basically. She was in the office in London of my Canadian publisher who was considering Plague and Fire, and these people are very good at reading upside down. She said, C.C. Humphreys, I know C.C. Humphreys. What's he up to? And she said, and anyway, Kristen Cochrane told her, and they did a double deal. So I was paid out of London, edited out of Toronto, and again, I mean, Plague is probably my second most successful book because and this is slightly odd because 2 years ago I was in the Yukon teaching kids, and I got a message saying that Plague had been nominated for the Arthur Ellis Award, and I went, it's a crime novel award, isn't it? I'm not a crime novelist, except Plague is a murder mystery crime. I thought, well, that's odd. And then I won it, which was even odder. So so that was great. I could talk lots more, but obviously, and we haven't got much more time. We seem to be gobbling it up. But I have left a bit of time for questions, if anyone has questions for me. Yes? No? What? You forgot the question. Anything to do with anything, really. Or I'll just start telling you more stories. Would you like to hear more stories? Oh, there's a question.
You were talking a little bit when you were writing for Vlad, and talking about how tone and voice are really coming into that. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'm going to repeat it because they like to record it. Can I speak a little more about how tone and voice sort of crept into my consciousness as opposed to being just in my subconsciousness? Well, with Vlad, that what I talked about was the elephant in the room was always going to be the vampire. So I thought, there's a way of approaching this. And so I decided to write it, not well, it was a little self-conscious, though I tried not to, dun, 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 draw attention to it, but it had to be a sort of Gothic approach. So in the storytelling itself, there's a sort of Gothic setup, which, it's a story narrated by storytellers. And I set up a convention in the dungeon of Poinari Castle, where I had the good fortune to have that to myself for St. George's Day in 2007. You climb up 1,400 steps, and there's this ruin at the top of a mountain. I had it to myself, and it was where Vlad got up to some interesting stuff. But I decided I would set, and so structurally it was interesting as well. I decided I would set the initial part of the story and this framing device in the dungeon of Poinari Castle 5 years after his death. And the three people who knew him best, only woman he ever loved and who he treated very badly in the end, his best friend who betrayed him, and his confessor, were all dug out of their various holes around Wallachia and brought to this dungeon and placed in confessionals, one side of which sat, where the priest would sit, sat a scribe writing down what they said. On the other side sat the prisoner. And the two people who are interviewing them need to know the true story of Vlad. Can we turn him from the monster he's become 5 years after his death into the hero that a lot of people still thought him, because he was a hero to many. He still is today in Romania. So how can we do that? Let's hear the story. And then that allowed me to flash back to his actual life. It was a bit of a cheat because I was able to go into his mind, I said, through the three people's story. But that was very much the tonally what I was after. And so the voice really came out of that, that sort of need to nod to the Gothic. There's still a lot of people said, waiting, turned the last page and went, "Where's the vampire?" So no vampire. Yes. Oh, good.
So when we went and saw Shakespeare's Rebel at Bar on the Beach, I kept thinking you really should have been on that stage. So how come you weren't on that stage?
That's very sweet of you. The Shakespeare's Rebel was was my novel, the labor of my heart in many ways. Because one friend described it as a love letter to the theatre. It's about William Shakespeare's fight choreographer at the time and his oldest buddy, he's called John Lawley, and he's a great swordsman, a so-so actor, and a terrible drunk, which tends to get in the way of the swordplay, of course. It's a fine line. Drink enough, be brave. Don't drink too much and you're sloppy. Anyway, so it was about him and about the times that basically Shakespeare was writing Hamlet and all that particular obsessions of mine. I adapted it into a play, as Sean says, and it was put on at Vancouver's Shakespeare Festival. Why wasn't I on the stage? Well, we'd be here all day if I told you half the stories around it. I wish, in many ways, that I had been. The actor who ended up playing John Lawley obviously didn't like me, didn't like the play, didn't want to be there, and proceeded to try to screw it up as much as he could. So I was kind of upset about all that. But never mind. It's not a closed door. Hopefully, maybe another production will arise where I get to do it, because I had done it 2 years before at the best book launch ever. We did it. That's how that journey began at Bar on the Beach. The artistic director said, "Oh, why don't you launch the book here?" Expecting, the usual sort of 25 people and some lukewarm Chardonnay. 500 people showed up to the tent because we put on what? That's right. Oh, you were there. Oh, great. And we were, all dressed up, and there's lots of sword fighting and demos and readings and stuff. So it was great. So I played John Lawley that night. It was great. Any other questions? Yes, there's one at the back.
What was your favorite part of writing Jack Absolute?
My favorite part of writing Jack Absolute, I think, was getting to be sort of him again. Was getting to expand on something I'd done. I'd acted it sort of 20 years before, so to return to that sort of role that I'd love. But also to really dive into the 18th century, which I love. I love the 18th century. It seemed to be a time of sort of conversely greater freedom. They were merging out of the sort of middle age, sort of the medieval mentality into something more modern, and people had a sense of freedom about themselves, you know, and it was in England anyway, and so that was interesting, and it was just great fun. He's such a rogue, and he's got a sidekick called Arte, who's a Mohawk, and again, you know, that theory of putting everything you love into a story. So Jack wasn't just going to be an army officer; he was going to be the son of a baronet, but also a adopted Mohawk. You know, he could kill as easily with a small sword as a tomahawk. You know, and he turns into Daga Noeda of the Wolf clan of the Mohawk tribe. So it was huge fun. I'm getting the signal because we've got to clear out of this room, I believe, and stuff. So. Listen, I as I say, I had all this stuff written down, and I've gone through virtually none of it. So I hope you enjoyed yourself. I certainly did. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Thank you.